Hey everybody, Cybertal with you. We're continuing our dive into the life and brilliancy of Mikhail Tal. This, I would say, other than the game of Talish, is probably his most famous early game. This is a game he played. This is a training match. This is actually his trainer, Alexander Koblenz. And this is the teacher from whom he got a lot of his taste and predilection for crazy attacking play. This actually shares some similarities and consistencies in the ideas with the famous game Geller over Zurich 1953. That Alexander Koblenz in this game explicitly had in his mind the idea that we see in the game. Now, it's not accurate, but there is some aesthetic beauty to this game and how Koblenz tries to trap Tal's major pieces in the northeast corner of the board while he achieves a counterattack on the other side of the board. Doesn't work, but this is one of the most beautiful games of chess ever played, in my opinion. That the flow of attack versus counterattack is very attractive. It's not just a one-sided exhibition. This has some teeth to it. But Tal was white in this game. So standard Sicilian position. Knight c6, this would be the classical Sicilian. This is not as popular nowadays. Back in the 40s and 50s, it was quite popular, especially because of Botvinnik. He played this a lot when he was younger as black. Other options that have to be mentioned. A6 would be the Najdorf. This would be one of the established Cadillac openings of chess. It's something I played up to a certain age until I got tired of keeping up with all the theory. G6 would be even more theoretically heavy. Really, the only critical try for white is the Yugoslav attack. I think any other try in black is probably at least equal. But the Yugoslav, I would say white's better, but it takes 35 moves of theory to prove it. And it's incredibly irrational theory that you have to specifically memorize. So a lot of people are staying away from it now. E6 would be the Schaffeningen. This would be a little bit more of an old-fashioned move order. People shy away from this move order playing the Schaffeningen because of G4 here. This would be the Karish attack. It's generally agreed that white is better in the Karish attack. White's achieving this without any penalty, which this is usually a move you need to fight for in the Sicilian. So to play the Schaffeningen, a lot of people are waiting for a move order like this. And then you play e6 here, or bishop e3, e6. Although that's a little bit more dangerous because g4 is just a Parani attack, but that's another kettle of fish. So the pure Schaffeningen move order, it's still viable, but you're sort of running uphill a little bit. And that it's generally agreed that white gets a little bit of an edge, at least, in the Karish attack. But knight c6, classical Sicilian, perfectly sound, even if it's a little bit old-fashioned. Bishop g5, this would be the Richter Rouser. This is the only critical try for whites, aside from bishop c4. This would be the Sozin, and then this can get into some crazy theory like the Vladimirovich attack. But bishop g5, that's the established move. e6, knight b3. So white avoids the trade on d4 and just tucks this knight away. It can help defend the queen side. Another main theoretical path would be f4 here. And this will be a complex game, but knight b3 is perfectly viable. Queen b6, normal move here. Another move that can be played would be h6. And white is technically up a pawn, but that pawn is very much doubled, and it's quite weak, and it's in front of this castle king on the queen side. I think black has enough compensation for the pawn here. This is a fairly comfortable position for black, especially that doubled and nicely cover in front of the queen side. That is quite damaging for white. Queen b6 is a perfectly fine way of playing. f3. So this is always a common idea in the Sicilian instead of the f4 push. f3 sort of shores up the e4 pawn and just gets ready to push with g4 and so forth on the king side. e6. g4, rook d8. This is probably the first real error of the game. Queen c7 is a little bit more accurate. And this is one way of going. Black actually has good compensation for the pawn here. So black has the bishop pair, that is always an asset. This bishop on f6 is especially strong. Black can always just take in c3 and liquidate, and that makes white's extra pawns a double the nice-sided pawn, which isn't terribly useful. Plus, the queen side would be weak in that case. Rook d8, bishop e3. Tal plays h4 here. That's not the most accurate. g5 is the accurate move order. And then queen f2 here. This is a common idea in the Sicilian when you achieve this sort of structure. It's stopping this knight from hopping to b6 to properly reorganize. So now, black's position is a little bit cramped because this knight on d7 doesn't really have a good place to move. Plus, this queen can always reorganize over to the king side for an attack, so it's sort of a double-purpose move. 4, and then f4 takes a quick timeout to control the e5 square from both these knights. White has a humongous advantage here. This is a dream Sicilian position for white. So h4 a little bit inaccurate. b5, this is very laissez-faire. d5, when you play the Sicilian, whether it's the Scafaningen, the Najdorf, the Dragon, the Classical, the O'Kelly, getting d5 in is your ultimate positional goal. That's the move that you want to be checking every variation to see if that's viable. Here it completely equalizes. This is one potential line. And black's doing just fine. Basically, as soon as you achieve d5, all of your pieces are completely activated and freed. b5, it should lead to the previous line. So g6 is played here. This is sometimes a standard clearance sacrifice. Here it doesn't make as much sense. Queen f2 is better here. And then h5 is another alternative. I prefer the f4 of the previous note. This is a dream attacking position. But just another example, h5 is good too. And this is a good example of a crazy piece sacrifice. Basically, white just dumps this knight on a4 because he's landing on the king side first. Then, after bishop c4, just g6 is going to completely destabilize the entire king side. And white's on the verge of breaking through here. This is very nice. g6 should be wrong. So h takes. This is the wrong way of taking. When you're defending against a kingside attack like this, typically you want pawns to be able to stop up the open files. So hg completely opens the h-file, which is what white wants. fg is the correct way to take back because it leaves pawn cover in the way of the h-file. And then d5. As always, when you're playing the Sicilian, you want to be looking to achieve this move. And white's got a little bit of compensation, but this is completely up to white to prove this. This is a very nice position for black. This is definitely better for black. HG is on the verge of losing. This could be a decisive attack for white already, just because that open H file is getting occupied so quickly. Knight f6, this is nearly decisive error. Bishop f6, it prepares to defend the ultimate endpoint on the H file after we play g6. So here, rook h8 is impossible because of the bishop on f6, but even here, white is a near decisive initiative. It's hard to find a good answer to rook h1 and then just rook h8 and mating. But knight f6 doesn't even put up barriers. So d5, that is forced to stop queen h2 more or less. e5 is it doesn't throw away the advantage, but it's overly complicated. Just bishop f4. Just if we can achieve queen h2, we're on the verge of winning. So let's prepare it. And then f4, and that just simply prepares queen h2. There's a pin on the d file, so this is one potential line. And then bishop e2. We're just going to take on g4, crack open the files, and go to town. This is completely winning for white. Bishop f4. So this is giving away the entire advantage, and this is showing Tal's inexperience at this point. I think a year or two from now, he would have immediately just played queen h2. Again, this is the key to the position, just getting on that h file and getting on with breaking through. One potential line. This is actually on the verge of being more or less forced. So rook h7, invading to attack g7. And white White's down a pawn here, but it doesn't matter. White has a humongous initiative for the pawn. This king on e7 is incredibly dangerously placed. White should be winning here. Bishop f4 gives that all away and more. Bishop d6 is threatening knight d3, threatening knight x f3. King f8. Knight g6 is better. When you're defending against a kingside attack, the goal is to get your pieces over to prevent penetration. So here, the ultimate landing point for black, of course, or for white, is the square on h8. So the knight in f6 covers h7. Just get that knight to g6 to cover the h8 square. We can't trade queens, of course. That would just be a losing endgame. And this is just winning for black. Black is just up 2 pawns. And with these knights holding up the king side, white just doesn't have anything for the invested material. That's sort of the double-edged sword between a winning attack and just a losing endgame. Can be 2 or 3 moves. King f8, again, he explicitly mentioned after the game, or in interviews about the game, that he was thinking of this game, Geller Irve, from Zurich 1953. And you look that up, game it up your own time, but in that game, Irve intentionally sacrificed a rook to draw white's queen to h8, away from the rest of the game, and then immediately counterattacked and won in the center. So Koblenz, instead of winning simply with knight g6, he had this idea that he was going to let white's queen penetrate to h8 to draw those pieces from the rest of the board and then win with another counterattack. It's a lovely idea, but notice that black's counterplay on the queen side isn't nearly as developed as it should be. His counterplay isn't 2 or 3 moves from landing. His counterplay is 6 or 7 moves away from landing. That makes it much harder to justify allowing that penetration. So king f8, it's not an outright error, and black is still better here, but knight g6 is much simpler. So knight g8, again, this is the idea that he had, just tying up this knight to block the queen in the corner. Much simpler would just be king e7. Queen h3 is more or less forced. If queen takes on g7, and wins. So queen h3 is pretty much forced. And bishop d7, just finishing development. Black's up 2 pawns. And white has no genuine compensation for the material. The king on e7 is a little bit awkward, but after we start to untangle with moves like rook h8, we can tuck the king back away. But knight g8 just keeps everything way too exposed. Rook h7 hitting g7, so f5 is forced. Now the queen's defending g7. Bishop h6, so now there's 2 different pins. That g pawn is pinned because of rook x c7, and that knight in g8 is pinned to the king. Rook d7, if rook a7, and this is winning, so rook d7 is required to guard g7. Bishop x b5, rook f7, this should be collapsing, so knight g6 is the forced line, and this leads to some hilarious variations. So I worked all this out by myself. I think it's accurate, but you can be the judge of that. So knight g6, of course, it's hitting the queen. Knight d4, so now threatening knight x e6. Rook f7, and now a hilarious move. Bishop d7. I love, this is one reason I love chess, just the absolute beauty of that move. That bishop is stepping into being taken 1, 2, 3 different times. But as far as I can tell, that is correct. The correct move here. Best move, queen x d7. And then knight x e6, drawing the queen away. And then the fun only begins, because now black has a little bit of a choice here. As far as I can tell, knight 8 e7 is the best. And then the forced march gets to this point. This looks about balanced. White has a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces. But it's white's king's turn to be a little bit exposed here. I would say this is balanced. But this is certainly more testing than the game choice. Rook f7 should just collapse. And like I said, there's plenty other variations in there. You can check out the game notes. But Rook f7 in general should be collapsing here. Rook g1, just directly... it prevents knight g6, and it's directly punishing this g7 point here. So that's forced, defending g7 more. Knight d4, that's inaccurate. Just bishop x a6. Just eliminates the a6 pawn. Now we're threatening knight b5. Bishop x a6, now knight d4. And the point is, the bishop's no longer on c8 to guard that e6 pawn. So now we're threatening knight x e6, and we're threatening knight b5. And then knight b5 here. And then the knight, when it takes on d6, black won't be able to take back because g7 will fall, and white has a winning position. So knight d4 is... it's not throwing the win away, but it's less accurate. Knight g4, that's forced. Cover up the g file. Bishop e5, that's a mistake. Bishop f4 check is more durable. Main line of that would be this. Bishop e8, very clever move that I found. So in this position, white was threatening queen takes... back in this position, white was threatening queen x g8 check, followed by rook h8 mate. So that's why the rook moved to c7. So in bishop e8, we're recreating that threat. White's threatening to take on g8, and then rook h8 is mate, because this bishop is covering the f7 square. So the king runs, and then rook d1, this is a key move. White actually has some, still has a good initiative here, even though he's two pawns down. But this would force white to find the moves. Bishop e5 should just lose directly. Knight c6. This is another mistake. Again, this is Tal's inexperience. I think 2 years after this game, he would have been much more accurate in his prosecution of the attack. Knight f3 is much better, and it's much simpler as well. Just heading for the g6 square. And white's just up a rook. This is just outright winning. Knight c6 is very much inaccurate. Bishop x c3. This is also a mistake. AB would be best. This forces white to find the moves, at least. And white is completely winning here. Bishop e3. Taking in c3 is also crushing. That might actually be a little bit more simple, but bishop e3 is fine as well. d4. Rook gh1, so now white's threatening to take on g8 again with the queen, followed by rook h8 mate. Bishop g5. So this is completely tossing away white's advantage. Best move would be just to take an fx e6. And the point of this, it recreates that threat to take on g8. Basically, all of white's play is with the idea of justifying that queen being on h8. If we never manage to break through, then black might threaten to generate counterplay with a queen stuck on h8. So taking on e6, now we're threatening to take on g8. That justifies the queen's position on h8. F1 check. And cute little in-between move just stops any counterplay. The rook's defended by the bishop on b5. We win the queen the next move. This is outright winning. So bishop g5 should just throw away the win. d3. I mean, this is still a wickedly complicated position, so it's hard to blame either side for not handling the complications perfectly. Rook 1 h6, it's threatening rook f6 check, so that's the idea of d3. But black should just take on c6. And basically the forced line from here, so rook g7 is forced, and then the king runs. And the idea is the king gets out of dodge just in time. And just in time to force a perpetual. So now we just have a perpetual check. So that variation there, in my opinion, would be a very fair end to the game. Both sides have made mistakes. Both sides have gained ferocious counterplay against one another's kings. That would be a fair result. d3, it looks attractive because we're stopping rook f6. But after bx c3, king d1, now rook f6 is a threat again. And the difference in this variation, here, black doesn't have that Desperado with bishop xb2 check. He doesn't have any Desperado checks against the white king. The white king can just take on d2, perfectly safe. White's up in exchange here, and we still have a continuing immediate attack. Rook f7 is a block, and then queen x g7. This is the point where Koblenz resigned. The forced mate from here, I'm including this just for completionist, plus it's pretty. Takes on e6 to demolish the shelter. Discover check. And that's the forced line. So, beautiful game. Really the heart of the entire position. And this was a very inaccurate game. I mean, this was a young Tal, so he was still figuring out things. And Koblenz was his instructor, so he wasn't like a super grandmaster or anything. But very beautiful game. I think a couple years later, g6 never would have happened. Mature Tal of the 70s would have just played queen f2, and then strangled black to death this way. I think later Tal would have just seen bishop f4 and finished the position off. But even with all these errors, I mean, black is just winning here. Black is 2 pawns up. And the heart of the position was black chose this idea. He was trying to emulate a specific game. He was trying to emulate Geller-Erve, Zurich 1953, with king f8. And he wanted to replicate that idea of trapping the queen in the back rank and then achieving counterplay. I think the thing to take away from it isn't really even the soundness of the idea. The thing to take away from it is, in sharp positions like these, you can't play by example. You can't think to yourself, oh, I'm going to play like this other game. In a sharp position like this, all of your play has to be based on calculation. Calculation is the absolute heart of chess, even quiet positional play. So here, Koblenz's undoing, in my opinion, was the fact that he wanted to play by metaphor. He wanted to play by analog, rather than just calculating his own position for himself. I mean, in this position, knight g6 is just a simple win. It's not complicated. You can end your calculation here. Both these knights on the king side are locking everything up. The attack is over. The attack is over before it began. But because Koblenz got carried away trying to play by analog with this Geller-Erve game, that was black's ultimate downfall. Because here, white's just able to penetrate and start to actually put pressure in black's position. And there were ups and downs from here. But after this, I mean, all of white's pieces are just hammering black's king side. And it's a rare position where you can survive this. In my opinion, after this, the results of a win for white is just completely justified. So no matter what position you're in, don't play by analog. Calculate for yourself and evaluate the position objectively. So, beautiful game. Next few Tal games will be a little bit less complicated. These two have been very dense. So they're very analytically dense, but we're going to keep diving in. My name is John. I'll see you then.